The machines stopped. Not gradually, not with warning. At 11:47 local time, every iron ore extraction operation in Western Australia went silent. 2 billion tons of annual production gone. And the Chinese steel mills that depend on that ore, they have 17 days of inventory left. 17 days before the global manufacturing system collapses. The surface story sounds like politics. Australia and China, trade tensions, diplomatic disputes, the kind of headlines that cycle through news feeds without anyone paying real attention. But this isn't politics. This is the moment when 20 years of economic integration just got severed permanently. And the consequences? They're going to ripple through every supply chain, every manufacturing process, every finished product that depends on steel, which is everything. Let me show you what actually happened at 11:47 this morning. Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton, Fortescue Metals Group, the three largest iron ore producers in the world, operations that collectively extract 800 million tons of ore annually, 800 million tons that flows directly into Chinese blast furnaces. All of them received the same message simultaneously. Immediate cessation of all exports to China. No exceptions, no transition period, no negotiations. The mining equipment that operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, it went silent. Conveyor belts that move 17,000 tons per hour stopped. Port facilities designed to load 300,000-ton bulk carriers, empty. 800 million tons of annual iron ore production, gone. But here's what makes this different from every other trade dispute you've seen. Iron ore isn't manufactured. It isn't assembled. It isn't produced in factories that can relocate or retool. Iron ore exists in specific geological formations that took millions of years to create. Australia controls 43% of global iron ore reserves, the highest quality ore, the ore that Chinese steel mills were designed to process. You can't substitute it. You can't replace it. You can't engineer around it. When Australian ore stops flowing, Chinese steel production doesn't slow down. It stops. This is where things stop making sense. Because China produces 57% of the world's steel. 57%. Every car manufactured globally contains Chinese steel. Every building constructed uses Chinese steel components. Every appliance, every piece of infrastructure, every industrial machine, they all depend on Chinese steel production. And Chinese steel production just lost access to its primary raw material. 17 days. That's how long Chinese steel mills can operate on current inventory levels. After 17 days, without Australian ore, the blast furnaces start shutting down. When Chinese steel production stops, global manufacturing stops. Not gradually, not sector by sector. Everything stops. But here's where it gets more dangerous. The decision to halt iron ore exports, it didn't come from Rio Tinto or BHP Billiton. It didn't come from market forces or business considerations. It came from Canberra, from the Australian government, as a matter of national security policy. National security, not trade policy, not economic leverage, national security. When governments frame resource control as national security, they're not thinking about negotiations or compromises. They're thinking about permanent strategic advantage. And the timing tells you this decision was coordinated with other actions that haven't been announced yet. Because 17 days isn't just Chinese steel mill inventory, it's also the timeline for something else, something that makes the iron ore ban look like preparation, not retaliation. Let me give you the numbers that should terrify anyone who understands supply chains. China imports 1.1 billion tons of iron ore annually. Australia supplies 460 million tons of that total. Without Australian ore, China has a supply deficit of 42%. You cannot replace 42% of a critical raw material overnight. You cannot substitute lower quality ore without redesigning entire steel production processes. You cannot source alternative supplies when Australia controls the highest grade deposits on the planet. This isn't a market disruption. This is a structural break in the global industrial system. And the break? It was designed to be permanent. Because here's what the Australian government knows that nobody else is admitting. China has been using steel production as a weapon, dumping excess steel into global markets to destroy competitors, building overcapacity, specifically to control international pricing. For 20 years, Australian ore fed Chinese steel mills that destroyed American steel companies, European manufacturers, and industrial capacity across developed economies. Now Australia is turning off the tap, not to negotiate better prices, to permanently shift global steel production away from China. But here's where individual disruptions become systemic crisis. Steel isn't just a commodity, it's the foundation of industrial civilization. Construction, transportation, energy infrastructure, manufacturing equipment, everything requires steel. When steel production gets disrupted, it doesn't just affect steel companies. It affects every company that uses steel, every project that requires steel, every economy that depends on industrial production. And the disruption, It's about to cascade through systems that aren't prepared for sudden scarcity. Automotive manufacturing. The average car contains 1.2 tons of steel. Global auto production is 85 million vehicles annually. That's 102 million tons of steel demand just from automotive. If Chinese steel mills shut down, where does that steel come from? United States annual steel production is 72 million tons. European Union produces 158 million tons. Combined, they can't replace Chinese capacity. Construction industry. Steel consumption for buildings and infrastructure represents 40% of global steel demand, 400 million tons annually. Construction projects planned and financed based on steel availability that no longer exists. Energy infrastructure. Wind turbines require 200 tons of steel each. Solar panel mounting systems, power transmission towers, pipeline construction. The green energy transition depends on steel availability that just became questionable. When you map steel requirements across industrial sectors, you realize that Chinese steel production isn't just an economic input. It's a systemic dependency that cannot be quickly replaced. The 17-day countdown isn't just about Chinese inventories. It's about how long the global economy can function before steel scarcity forces industrial shutdowns worldwide. But there's a deeper layer to this crisis that nobody wants to acknowledge. The iron ore ban isn't happening in isolation. It's coordinated with other resource restrictions that are activating simultaneously. Lithium, rare earths, copper, nickel. Critical materials that flow through supply chains controlled by countries that are now demonstrating their willingness to weaponize resource access. When Australia cuts off iron ore to China, when China responds by restricting rare earth exports to everyone else, when other resource-rich nations realize they can use material scarcity as geopolitical leverage, the entire foundation of global trade shifts. From market-based pricing to strategic allocation, from commercial relationships to resource alliances, from economic integration to resource nationalism. And resource nationalism leads to resource wars, which brings us to copper, because copper just hit $15,000 per ton, not because of copper supply disruption, because smart money understands what the iron ore ban signals about resource warfare escalation. Copper is the other critical material that Chinese manufacturing depends on. Electrical systems, electronics, industrial equipment, renewable energy infrastructure, all of it requires copper. If iron ore can be weaponized overnight, if decades of trade relationships can be severed with 17 days' notice, what happens when copper supply gets restricted? The price movement tells you institutional investors are already positioning for that scenario. $15,000 per ton represents a 47% increase in 6 hours. That's not market speculation. That's panic positioning ahead of supply chain breakdown that extends far beyond iron ore. But here's what makes the copper spike particularly dangerous. Copper supply chains are more concentrated than iron ore. Chile controls 28% of global copper production. Peru has 12%. China controls significant portions of processing capacity. When resource warfare spreads from iron ore to copper, when multiple critical materials become weapons simultaneously, industrial civilization doesn't just face higher costs. It faces material shortages that cannot be resolved through price mechanisms. And the shortages, they create cascading failures across interconnected systems that depend on just-in-time delivery of critical materials. The iron ore ban was the trigger, copper is the amplifier. But the real systemic risk comes from what happens when resource warfare becomes the default mechanism for international disputes. Because once countries realize they can achieve strategic objectives by controlling material flows, and once resource access becomes conditional on political compliance, the entire structure of global trade breaks down, not temporarily, not until negotiations resolve differences, permanently. And in a world where resource access depends on political alignment, countries without domestic resource supplies become strategically vulnerable. The United States imports 80% of its rare earth elements. Europe imports 95% of its lithium. Japan imports 100% of its iron ore. When resource suppliers start choosing customers based on geopolitical considerations instead of commercial terms, resource-dependent countries lose the foundation of their industrial capacity. They become vassals, not through military conquest, through material dependency that gets weaponized. The iron ore ban suggests that weaponization phase has begun. China responded within hours, not with diplomatic protests or trade negotiations, with export restrictions on antimony and germanium, critical materials for semiconductor manufacturing and defense applications. Tit for tat. Resource restriction for resource restriction. Industrial material warfare. And both sides, both Australia and China, they're prepared for extended economic warfare that treats critical materials as weapons rather than commodities. Which means this crisis doesn't resolve through negotiations or compromise. It escalates until one side's industrial capacity collapses. The 17-day timeline isn't about finding alternative suppliers. It's about how long the global economy can function, while two major powers weaponize the materials that keep industrial civilization operating. 17 days to understand that the globalized economy you thought was permanent, it just ended. Not through war, not through financial crisis, through resource nationalism that makes industrial interdependence impossible. And the new system, the system that replaces globalized trade, it's being built right now, not through international agreements or multilateral institutions, through resource alliances and material partnerships that exclude countries without strategic materials. The iron ore ban was the announcement. The copper price spike was the confirmation. What comes next? That's the reallocation. From global supply chains to regional resource blocks, from market-based pricing to strategic allocation, from commercial relationships to material dependencies that determine geopolitical alignment. The machines stopped at 1147, but the system they supported, the system of global economic integration, that stopped too. What replaces it won't be negotiations or trade deals. It will be resource wars that determine which countries have access to the materials required for industrial survival. And industrial survival, in a world where materials become weapons, that's not about economic efficiency anymore. It's about who controls the ore. The countdown started at 1147, 17 days until Chinese steel production stops. But the real countdown, the countdown to resource warfare becoming the primary mechanism of international relations, that countdown just reached zero. The machines have stopped. The question is whether you understand what starts when the global supply chains built on those machines break down permanently. Because breakdown isn't the end of the story. It is the beginning of resource wars that will determine the structure of industrial civilization for the next century. And those wars, they just began.